Good evening, everyone. The writer works with words, so he or she deals with language and meaning. To write is to make use of, to deploy words as a statement. And to make a statement is often to reveal, to disclose a world in which, in the words of the Somalian writer, Nuruddin Farah, things that are hiding are in plain sight. This evening we have two writers for whom writing is about a commitment of disclosure, of making plain what the ideas, the frameworks, the symbolic order of our social order, what all these things elide, what it wants us to forget, what it wants to displace or to hide. Both Edwidge Danticat and Jesmyn Ward are writers who, to use the words of Ida B. Wells, troubles the waters. They are writers who deploy language, words as utterances, statements which create alternative inventories, alternative histories. Both sometimes engage in the genre of the memoir. Danticat, Brother, I Am Dying, Ward, Men We Reaped. In these memoirs, they give accounts of men from what may seem to be two disparate points in the Americas, Haiti and Mississippi. But as one reads these words, we are confronted with the question, are these places really different? Recall the historical circulation of black bodies during racial slavery. Recall, even more recent, the arguments in the 1950s in the Academy about the plantation, generated first at Columbia University at an institute called the Research Institute for the Study of Tropical Man. Arguments in which the plantation was seen as both the Caribbean and the South, as plantation America. But importantly, we might want to remember the links between Haiti and Mississippi in, say, the words of Edwidge Danticat herself. And this is what Danticat says in Writing Dangerously. As I watched all this unfold again on my television set, she's talking about Katrina, this time in the streets of New Orleans in the summer of 2005, I couldn't help but think, Danticat writes, of the Bush administration's initial response to the Haitian victims of the tropical storm Jenny, the year before Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans. $60,000 in aid and the repatriation of Haitian refugees from the United States to the devastated regions, even before the waters had subsided. New Orleans' horrific tragedy had been foreshadowed in America's so-called backyard, and the initial response, Danticat writes, quoting from Zora Neale Hurston, "Poor man ain't got no business at the show." So poor man ain't got no business at the show. Writing either from Mississippi or from Haiti, these writers give us a different insight, a way of seeing life and ways of life from the perspective of the poor man who ain't got no business in the show. For Jesmyn Ward, it is the same thing. This is what she says in her memoir. Because this is my story, just as it is the story of those lost young men, and because this is my family's story, just as it is my community story, it is not straightforward. To tell it, I must tell the story of my town and the story of my community. And then I must revisit each of the 5 young black men who died, following them backward in time. And to follow backward in time, I would suggest for both these writers is to call memory to the fore. But memory not as a faculty of recall, but rather memory as a way to render historical accounts of Black lives beyond the reach of statistics and data. It is therefore these writers' work to humanize Black lives with care and, yes, with love. So tonight we are in the presence of two writers whose gifts presents us with worlds that confront us at our core self. For these two writers, to write is to bear witness and to create an inventory of what they see in the world that we live in. In a world that we live in, a broken world, they both therefore write dangerously. These are gifts, necessary gifts, for us to change the world into a more humane place. So we give thanks to these two writers for their gifts. Miss Jesmyn Ward and Miss Edwidge Danticat, give thanks.
Thank you, Professor Bogues. So I am incredibly honored and excited to be on the stage with you. You are two of my favorite writers. And I should say that the genre of the interview, the kind of moderated conversation, is also one of my favorite genres. So I've read interviews with you, I've watched you already, I've studied the work. But I have to say there's another interview I watched, and this is the way we're not going to go. This is a moment where Christopher Lydon is interviewing Susan Sontag. It's like a 7-minute interview on television, and she's put out with him from the get-go. And then he mentions Camille Paglia, and he's asking her softball questions. They're utterly innocuous, but she will have none of it. And at one point, she just turns to him and says, "I've been interviewed a lot, and I have never been asked such questions. Do you ask your other guests these questions? Do people have answers on the tip of their tongues to such questions?" So I want you to know that if I ask you such a question, you should feel free just to look at me. It will be our code. "Ralph, I don't have an answer on the tip of my tongue to such a question," and we'll be fine. But before we dive in, I have a question I want to ask both of you, but I know as an alum, you must have some words about Brown that you want to say, Edwidge.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. I was telling them in the back, I said I feel like as an alum who has also gotten a bonus degree from the university, I should address for myself the elephant in the room, and that is I want to throw my support to the and show my solidarity with the coalition of concerned graduate students of color who are rightfully addressing issues of economic inequality, racial and gender, trans and queer issues here, and I feel like I was telling Professor Bogues in the back, I don't think your demands are unreasonable for faculty hires and retention, historical accountability, and better quality of life for students of color on this campus. So I'm behind you, I am with you, and you have my support. This is what I wanted to say.
Thank you, that's beautiful, and I know it's deeply appreciated. Let's dive in there, though, because the talk is called Writing About a Broken World. And I guess I'm wondering what both of you think about the social responsibility of the artist. It's kind of a time-worn question, but it's also a very timely question at this moment. So what do you see as the role of you as writers in affecting social change? Can writing affect social change?
I hope so. I don't know if this is working. I hope it can. I mean, I think that's part of the reason that I wanted to be a writer, from the very beginning, right, when I was younger, because I grew up in Mississippi. I grew up with, in a place where the culture sort of constantly told me that I was less, and that I was not human. And part of what I wanted to do when I came to writing was I wanted to push back against that and to speak against it, in the hope that maybe some in the future, that some kid who might have, approached me like that, or, who might have thought that I was less, or the people that I came from, were less. Like a kid like that would read my work and see us as human beings and empathize with us. And maybe it would change something about the way that they saw us and saw the world. And so I hope that, that the artist has that power to, to humanize and to create some sort of change.
Well, I think I knew very early on that the artist had that power because I grew up at a time in a society where they were always trying to kill writers. And so during the dictatorship, the dictators, in our case, Papa Doc Duvalier, wanted to be a writer. He fashioned himself a poet, but they wanted to silence writers. So I think for a young person who wanted to be a writer, that reinforced the power of the writer, the fact that there was so much effort to silence what they had to say. So I think I've always carried with me as a kind of hope that there is power in words, that words can travel. There's a Haitian proverb that says, "Parole gen pied, parole gen ailes." Words have wings, words have feet. And I think there's also the power of sharing and also empowering people with that words. And it began for me with this idea that there was so much effort put in trying to silence writers. They must have something important that to say, is what that message that I received from those efforts.
Right, and I think the other thing I like about both of you are saying, you often can't know the impact of your work. And the Stuart Hall idea of working without guarantees, you talk about it in Creating Dangerously, about you don't know and what it means to read dangerously. When someone might pick up your book now and be moved by it, or it might take years for it to be moved by it. And there's a moment in Creating Dangerously where you're speaking about the Greeks and the importance of Greek writers to Haitian writers and to Haitian readers. And you take up Jason and Medea throughout Salvage the Bones. And it's such an interesting idea about Greek writers in Haiti at the moment of the revolution. Jason and Medea and pit bulls fighting and Salvage the Bones. Can you just expound on that kind of influence of the Greeks?
Well, there was this one example. There's a Haitian writer named Félix Maurice Leroy, who, during the dictatorship, if people were killed, their bodies were left on the street. People couldn't go and pick them up because that would immediately sort of align you with a rebel. And so this writer, Félix Maurice Leroy, staged in the middle of that stage Antigone and translated in Creole. And so it was a way to get past the censors and get past because it was just some people in togas. So they would put on plays like Camus' Caligula, like that at the student center, and it was a way of, just saying this is what's happening. So it was used as a kind of shield. So that's a very concrete example where this particular writer especially would use these Greeks, would use stories like that to show the parallels in what people were living, and he kept himself from being exiled the longest out of all these other writers by translating these Greek plays that had these parallels in Haitian life during the dictatorship.
I know it was common for Marquez to use a lot of code in his work as well. And I know that Esh I think it's her sophomore year, and she's off and she's reading about the Argonauts. And how does that work into Salvage the Bones?
I think that initially that was a lucky accident because she's this girl who's growing up in this very isolated place, and I knew that she was going to be isolated because of where she lived, and at least in her house in the town geographically, and also because the town itself is really small and sort of cut off from the areas around it. And so I wanted her to read, like to have summer reading to do, so that she'd have some other sort of reference to understand her world and understand, who she is sort of growing up to be. And as I was like casting about for something that she could read, like some book, I happened to have a copy of Edith Hamilton's Mythology on my desk. And I looked at it and I said, well, why can't she read Edith Hamilton's Mythology? I read it when I was in high school, so she can just read that. And I didn't understand how important that particular myth would be to Salvage the Bones, because as I was writing Salvage the Bones, I read Edith Hamilton's mythology at the same time, and then suddenly, like it was as if Ash and I, as if we were reading the book together, because when I, stumbled across the tale of Jason and the Argonauts, I stopped, and there was something about like that Medea's, character, and how, she's this mortal woman that wielded such great power in that world, and she was a lover, and she was a mother, and she was a sister, and so, she's just this figure that sort of comes out of nowhere, and she's so different from the mortal women, that you encounter in the first half of the book. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, as soon as I came to that part, I thought, okay, Ash would take notice of this, like she'd stop, and this would, there's something about this myth that speaks to her experience, right? Mm-hmm. And to that, I think, maybe that troubles her, but in some ways empowers her, because she's this poor black girl and she has no power at all. So it would mean something to her to, come across this tale of this woman who, in that world, should have had no power, mm-hmm. but actually does have a great deal of power. And so, I got stuck, and she got stuck. And then that myth became really important in the writing of the book. And it was a lucky accident, and I'm very grateful for it. And I feel like, maybe sort of, subconsciously, I was, fulfilling this urge, in my work, that I feel like a lot of, the South, the American South, has, for, decades, right, hundreds of years, have had this like romantic relationship with Greek mythology, and mm-hmm. with the classical world, in our architecture and in our myths, and so maybe that some of that was playing out, sort of subconsciously in Salvage the Bones too.
Yeah, it works perfectly. I mean, I despised having to read Edith Hamilton in high school. And there was a minute when I was just like, okay, now I need to go back to Hamilton and read it. And I know that you've talked about China has Medea as well. And yeah, it's perfect. But there's something about listening to you talk about Mississippi and the poverty, mm-hmm. and how you write so eloquently about Haiti and New York, that I know place is really vital to your work. And I'm wondering if it's vital to you as a writer, and how that matters. Like, you've gone back to live in Delisle, and Mississippi really matters to you. So if you could talk a little bit about place in your work and your own identity in Haiti, and going back and people asking you to like get your uncle out and you can't, and the expectations there, and bringing Haiti to life for us in the States. Yeah, I just want to hear you talk a little bit about Haiti as well.
Well, I think place in terms of immigration, especially immigration that you don't choose, right? Mm-hmm. Because I moved here from Haiti when I was 12, and there was this whole period. My father came first when I was 2, my mother when I was 4, and then those 8 years I was with my uncle, and then at 12 I go from Port-au-Prince to New York City, and it's not like now, like my younger people in my family who come now, you're texting with them all the time. They've seen movies. It wasn't so much. I had no idea what I was coming to. It's like, I think Junot Diaz talks about it for his own experience. He sort of compares it to space travel. Mm-hmm. It was really literally like you get into this big machine and you land in another world. And even the family world was different because of my 2 brothers who were born in New York. So it was like just landing in a whole different context. So I think then in situations like that where you're wrenched from a place, or when you have to leave a place, it becomes implanted in your mind, and then you sort of reinterpret it through the work. And so I used to read, when I moved to Brooklyn, I used to read to go home. I would read to try to go back to Haiti through the books, literature, and that I had not read while I was in Haiti, and I was writing, and then I started writing to go home. Mm-hmm. And I was writing my own version of that place, because also I was longing to see it. So I think the attachment to place is like this effort to recreate it, not just for others, but also for myself, because I was away from it.
Yeah, I want to come back to you about that in a minute, about the creation for yourself, but I want to hear about Mississippi.
That's so interesting that you said that, because I feel like when I first began attempting, to write, that's part of what I wanted to do as well. Like, that's why I wrote about, Mississippi and rural Mississippi, in part because I wanted to return there. And when I began writing, I was, I was in New York City. I was living in New York City, and then I was living in Michigan, and then I was living in California. So it was a way for me to return, even though Mississippi was more accessible for me. But I think that that place is very important in my work. I feel committed to the community that I come from, to the place that I come from. Like, I feel a responsibility to tell the stories that I do about the place that I'm from. And maybe because I've, at least in my community, we haven't had many people that have done that for us. And so, because I've been, given this opportunity and this voice and this talent, like, I want to, to create that space for us, and to tell our stories, and get them, to bring them to readers and to audiences. Yeah, but it's something that I think that I'm always thinking about when I'm, especially when I'm working on fiction. Like, I think about it in terms of of characters, of how characters will see the world, how they will understand the world, how they will express themselves on the page, and how that place will influence how they see the world and how they see themselves and how they express themselves on the page. So I feel like it colors everything that I do. It informs everything that I do.
Yeah, one of the the powerful things in your memoir is that you feel that devotion to the place. And I wondered, do you worry about, was change an element of that for you? Were you thinking?
Yep. I think so. I mean, I feel like when I write about the place that I'm from, I write about a fictionalized version of it, in my fiction, of course, and then even in Men We Reaped, I'm trying to capture especially after Hurricane Katrina occurred. After Hurricane Katrina occurred, I realized that the home that I grew up in, and the place that I knew, that place just didn't exist anymore. And so I think that I was attempting to, I wrote, my first novel, my second novel, everything that I've written, I wrote all of it after Katrina. So I feel like, in some respects, I'm trying to rewrite that place that I lost, maybe, and claim that place that I lost, and allow that place to live again, even if it's just in the pages of a book. Is that? Do you feel like some of that is?
Yeah, I'm thinking of, there's this, in Invisible Cities, the Calvino says the description of the city is not the city. and often, especially, there's that tension between sort of people who are still in a place and people who have left, and this questioning of sort of your right to write about the place, right? Because you don't live there anymore. And I do think that factors. So the first part of writing about a changing place is that to say, I'm writing my version, and it's intimate, and I feel like I've gone through this process of trying to write about actual places, and then saying, okay, I'm just going to invent my own place within that setting, so that it's just all mine. Because after Birth Eyes Memory, I remember people would come up and say, that tree in the corner of street such and such? It doesn't exist. And so then I would say, okay, then I created this place called Ville Rose, and it felt so much more like, okay, I own this place, and I can put a lighthouse wherever I want, I could do. And there was a kind of also freedom in that I can borrow from different places, and it felt more fluid than than just like trying to write about an actual place and an actual time.
Yeah, there's so many things now in my head from all of this. There's so this idea that one can't go back home again. And, I grew up in a very working class neighborhood. When I go back, it's quite different now that I've been a professor for a while. And it must be similar when you all try to go back home. So that's in my head. But then the other thing that you're both kind of getting at when you say you want to bring Mississippi to life, or you want to bring Haiti to life, or people say, no, that tree's not there. It feels like a burden often gets placed upon writers to represent their groups. And in Creating Dangerously, you're very careful to eschew that. I'm writing my story when you get called out. This is my story. At the end, when you're talking about Guernica and the earthquake, you very generously and very kind of carefully say, well, now I might speak collectively. So I guess I want to know two things. One about, they're separate, but can one go back home again, and then what does that look like? And then the burden of speaking for a group versus speaking for oneself, and how you navigate that. And either of you can start.
Well, I feel like it's a burden that is often placed on writers of color, or writers from marginalized groups, and suddenly, so our work then is read like anthropology or sociology, and so people are like, okay, so everybody, and because fiction also demands, like, you have to write about the least. I mean, often a character is worthy of 300 pages because they're exceptional. They're either an exceptional liar, an exceptional thief, or an exceptional something that then gives rise to some kind of conflict, right? They're not, characters in fiction are not usually model citizens approved by the tourism board of a small country, right? So you're always going to have like a really messed up individual. And add to that, like there's like, oh, this person is the only Haitian I've ever read about, then what are you doing to the culture, So I think that's where the trickiness comes from, is that as sort of writers of color, we always have to remind people this is a singular character and a singular story. It's not representative of our entire group. We do not speak for the entire group. It's something that we have to keep restating. I mean, it's the core of like Chimamanda Adichie's TED Talk, like the danger of a single story, because then it sort of shuts down. And there's also this thing in publishing where it's sort of like one at a time kind of situation. I think that makes it very complicated in terms of the stories that get told and that then are forced to become representative stories.
I feel like it's something that I worry about often in my work, right? So when I think about audience, I worry about, like I look at my characters and I look at them in, sort of very sort of simple ways, right? So if I'm writing a synopsis of the character that I'm writing about, and I think, okay, so this is, so if I think about Skeeta from Salvage the Bones, so this is a kid who fights dogs, right? And so it's something that I worry about, like representation, I guess, and how my characters will be perceived, and if, someone will see this representation of this young, black, man who is troubled in some respects, and who maybe sometimes does not make the best decisions, in his life, and who sometimes, does things that aren't very smart or maybe cruel, right? So if people will read this and then will make assumptions, right, about everyone else, all young black men in the South. So it's something that I worry about often, but that I try to counteract through really like investing in the depiction of the character, and like developing the character on the page, and making, the character as complex and as unique as and as human and as alive as I possibly can. And so I think that hopefully that then, if that character really does live fully on the page, then that will counteract some of that, because they'll be unique. But that's my way of trying to, I guess, navigate it. But I don't think that it's rough.
I think another thing that counteracts that is having as many other people out there as possible, right? Yeah. To tell as many different stories as possible, too. Yeah. So that it's not on like the burden, like, so you don't have to think about that.
And it seems like it can come from both spaces. It could come from the space of one's communities, and it can come from people who are outside of one's communities who do pick up the book. Well, let me read the sociology of African Americans in the South. Oh, Jesmyn Ward, Salvage the Bones. Let me read Haiti, and etc. But you have this beautiful phrase, I want to quote you if you don't mind, about narrative ruthlessness. Right? You're in this interview, and they're asking you if your work is political, and you say, quote, I realized that if I was going to assume the responsibility of writing about my home, I needed narrative ruthlessness. I couldn't dull the edges and fall in love with my characters and spare them. Life does not spare us. And I wonder if we might talk a little bit about not sparing our characters and about narrative ruthlessness in the writing of fiction and even in the writing of your memoirs, both of you. Like, you don't dull edges, I would say.
So as a younger writer, I feel like I failed in some respects. Like I failed when I wrote, a lot of my earlier short stories. I definitely think I failed in some ways when I wrote my first novel because I was, dulling the edges. I was sparing my characters. I loved my characters so much, and they reminded me of people that I knew so much. I mean, there are no one-to-one correlations, but, I was, writing about, a place like the place that I came from. I was writing about people like the people that I'd grown up with and known and loved. And so I think that I was so in love with the characters in the same way that I'm in love with the place that I come from and the community that I come from, that I couldn't let the story come alive. I couldn't, it was impossible for me to let really bad things happen to my characters because I didn't want anything bad to happen to them because I loved them so much. And so I think that I failed in some ways because I didn't understand that I had to be ruthless, right? So I didn't understand that my job as a writer wasn't to coddle my characters and create these fairy tales for them to live, or my job as a writer was to, look at the realities of what it was like, for, people in the kind of community that I came from, look at the realities of their life, and then write in a way that reflected that. Because I did not do that. And so when I was working on my second novel, Salvage the Bones, I was very kind. Of course, that was after Hurricane Katrina, and so I was very conscious of the fact that I couldn't coddle my characters and I couldn't spare them because, like I said, life does not spare us. And also at that time, when I was working on Salvage the Bones, that was after 2004, so I'd lost my brother, I'd lost my friends, I'd lost my cousin at that point, and so I knew, life had taught me at that moment that, that bad things happen all the time, and that I couldn't, it would be dishonest of me, I think, to write in a way that, to write in a way that, that ignored that. Both in my fiction and then especially in the memoir, in the creative nonfiction. I mean, it was, at home, and I'm sure this is true in most places, right? When someone dies, they become saints, right? I mean, that's the natural reaction that I feel like close family or that family members and people in the community, that we have, they become angels, in our personal mythology that we have, and so I had to write against that, and it was a very conscious decision that I made to avoid that and to try to write about my brother and my cousin and my friends and and my family members and even myself, to write to write about us honestly and to depict us as flawed people on the page, who are capable of, of kindness and tenderness and love and compassion and generosity, but also capable of, anger and cruelty and foolishness, at the same time. So, but yeah, so that is also something I think that I think about often when I'm writing, right? So that this need to be honest.
I would say those are fiercely honest books. And what about you in Spare and Care?
I think I was the opposite. Like when my first readers were my younger brothers, who, when they would read the stories, they'd be like, "Why does everybody die?"
What's a Danticat book?
So I think I was ruthless to begin with. I actually had to learn the opposite. Like, I had to learn to spare my characters, and I'm growing towards that, to show them a little mercy. But I think I did start with, by my uncle, who I grew up with in Haiti, was a minister. Mm-hmm. So our routine was like, my life was that we might have, you have a wake on Friday, a wedding on, a funeral on Saturday, a wedding on Sunday. It was just like from the time I was very young, so the whole cycle of life was happening before us. And so I was always very intrigued with death. And for me, that was the natural conclusion of every story. We all die. So I really had to, I had to kind of rein. I think I started out ruthless, and as I get older, I just like the nuanced part of like the living part, because then you've seen more death closer up. But to me, I think I started out pretty ruthless, and I'm grateful that I also felt like I felt uncensored in the beginning, and I think that's why also you feel like your first book, like my first book, got a lot of criticism because I felt like, I could write whatever I want, and I'm happy that I had that, because that feeling like you feel like nobody's going to read it anyway, you could write whatever you want. And I really am grateful, for example, for Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, because I know after reading that book and then seeing her like the contrast of the sadness of the book and then the vibrancy of her life. I saw her here when I was at Brown, and thinking, you could have both. I think that for me was really powerful. That example was very powerful in writing Breath, Eyes, Memory, and that I just felt like, I could say whatever I want.
Yeah. I guess in Claire of the Sea Light, I guess you're a little delicate with Claire, and you're even delicate with the fisherman, who we don't quite know and dies, and Claire is at the end.
Yeah, but I think as one gets closer to death oneself, you're kind of it's harder to parcel out, You just feel like, let me be kinder.
Yeah, I playfully say I have more yesterdays than tomorrow. I'm not ready for that.
Yes.
And you both write so much about destruction and devastation, whether it's Katrina, or the earthquake, or the dictatorships and the loss of lives there. But you also have a bit about survival, and I'm wondering how you work with grief and survival in the work, and how you begin to think about life after a massacre, life after a dictatorship, life after a hurricane in which you feel like the country has utterly abandoned you.
That's a difficult question. I don't.
Do people have answers on the tip of their tongues?
I don't. Grief is. It's interesting because also like reading Men We Reap. It's a book about grief, right? Mm-hmm. And Brother, I'm Dying was for me a book about grief, and it was processing grief through that work, because when I sat down to write that book, I'd never written a book so fast in my life, and part of it I realized was because it was like visiting with my father. Brother, I'm Dying is about the death of my father and uncle and the birth of my daughter. So it was like every time I sat down, I felt like I was visiting with my father and uncle. I was like, for that moment of the writing time, they were with me. And grief is something that I think you had such a you had just like the book so shows that so powerfully, to have all of those deaths, come together, and you do have, as you get older, you experience more grief. It has a compounding effect, like the way it sort of like when my father died and my mother died last year, and the way you experience this next grief and how it informs the last one, and they're each different, but they're compounded, and your book does that so powerfully, because we experience all of it with you in this short period of time, that you're reading the book. But I think grief is just something that you're learning it as you go. You don't realize, like sometimes when you're watching other people's grief and you're like, how do they survive that? But we're lucky, I feel like I was lucky that I had this process through which to work through my grief with the words. And so that also informs then what you write after, having had actual grief versus virtual grief, like imagining grief for characters versus like writing your own grief and memoir. And I think then it follows what, you've gone through the process of experienced grief and then writing about grief. It's you come out very differently, I think, on the other side.
I definitely think that's true. I mean, I think, but before I wrote the memoir, I went to therapy a few times. But when I actually like sat down and began writing the memoir, I realized that much of the work that I should have been doing in therapy, I was doing it while I was writing the memoir. So there was, I think, much about like, my life, my brother's life, my friends' lives, my cousin's life, and then just like my family, my father and my mother and my sisters that I had never, that I hadn't been like clear-eyed about, I think, before I wrote the memoir. And so the process of writing the memoir, of being required to sit with, these sort of past incarnations of, the people that I loved, and then also of myself. And then I had to sit with them and think about their motivations, think about how they saw and understood the world, and figure out why they did some of the things they did. And then also I had to think about how those, how all those things affected me at the time and then now, right? Like as I'm writing the book. So I think that, that the process, right, that required me to be very present, in the past and in the present moment of writing the book, I think that did a lot to help me sort of understand that sense of loss, that I carry with me. And I think in some ways helped me to maybe to become, I don't know, I think in some ways it helped me to become reconciled to that fact, that this is something that I will live with for the rest of my life, right? This sense of loss, this sense of grief, this yearning. And I think that maybe I had avoided that realization beforehand, and I tried to, shrug it off and do things so that I wouldn't have to think about that. Mm-hmm. But I think that, that writing the memoir helped me to come to terms with that. And so in some ways, I think it was a healing process. Because, I feel like there was a lot of emotional work that I had not done, a lot of emotional revelations that I had while I was working on the novel. I mean, on the memoir, and they were important, and I'm glad that I had them now. And I think that I understand myself and also understand the people that I wrote about much better now.
And maybe you could even say, because I know we talked in the green room, so I don't feel bad asking this. I think another way that you wrestle with it are the tattoos on your wrist. And I don't know if everybody's had a chance to read Men We Reap, so you might want to tell the story. But that's a powerful bit of writing, and it's a powerful bit of you coming to terms with your own depression and mental health. And could you just talk about those tattoos?
Yeah, so after my brother died, I was struggling. I was very, despondent. I did not. It was a very difficult time for me, and I was very depressed. And I had always sort of struggled, I think, with like mild depression through, from when I was, I don't know, from probably puberty on. But then, of course, when my brother died, when I graduated from college. That depression, it enlarged, and it bore down on my entire, the entire world. And I did have suicidal thoughts at the time, like during the from 2000 to 2004, especially because, you know, I was constantly, you know, losing people that I loved and that I cared about. And so I had suicidal thoughts, and so I got the first tattoo out of desperation, right? Because I thought, okay, because I would think about like the ways that I could possibly kill myself. And I thought, well, the easiest way to kill myself would be to cut myself, to slit my wrists. And then I asked myself, like, you know, because I've been living with this grief and I see what it's done to me and I see what it's done to my sisters and to my mom and to my dad and to the people in my family and my community, like, could I actually do that to them? And then, you know, a part of me said, because evidently I asked myself questions and I answered my questions. and so part of me said, no, you can't, you know, like, you have to do something to prevent that, right? And so I thought, okay, I need a tattoo of my brother's name. Like, I know that if I get a tattoo of my brother's signature over the wrist that I would cut, that then I won't cut it, you know? And so that's what I did. I got a card that he'd given to my mother for Mother's Day, and he'd signed his name at the bottom of it. And so she, you know, gave it to me, and I brought it to the tattoo parlor, and they made a photocopy of it on the paper and then placed it on my wrist, and then they tattooed his name across it. And it worked for like a year. And then I thought, well, I have another wrist. and so I need another tattoo. And so when I was in college, my brother only wrote me, he wrote me one time, and it was during my freshman year of college. And he took so my mom is the kind of mom who, she used to take a ton of pictures, right? So she has these huge, thick photo albums. They're like this thick for each of us, right? So we all have our own photo album. And so my brother had gone into his photo album, and he had taken 2 of the pictures out. And so he wrote me a letter on paper, but then on like notebook paper, but then he also wrote little notes on the back of these pictures, and he sent them to me. And so one of them was a picture, it was a school picture that he'd taken. And he was really cute, right? And he had a high top fade, and he was wearing like a yellow sweater, and he was just very cute. And so on the back of the picture he wrote, "I know I'm cute." And then he signed it. He didn't sign it with his name, but he signed it "Love, Brother." And so I found that letter. I was looking through all of my stuff because I remembered that he had written me that letter. And so I found that letter, and I found those pictures, and I read that on the back, and I read "Love, Brother," and I thought, yep, that's what I need to put on my right wrist. I mean, on this wrist, you know, to stop me and to remind me, you know, of how much I love him and of what it means to live without someone that you love that much, so that I won't do that. And so I took that picture to the tattoo parlor, same tattoo parlor, and they made a copy of it, and then they tattooed that on my wrist. And then I want to say that, like, ever since then, I've done more therapy, and I've written a memoir. So I don't struggle with those thoughts the way that I did before. But it was important to me, again, to like be honest about that in the book because, first of all, because, you know, one of the young men that I write about, Ronald, right, he struggled with depression. He then, you know, died by suicide. So originally the bit about the tattoos and my own personal experience and my own struggle with depression, that was in his section. And so my Genius editor said, you might need to move this or put this in another place and take it out of this chapter because it's distracting, you know, it's switching the focus, right, from him to you, and you don't want to do that. And she was totally right. And so that's what I did. So I moved it and put it later in the book. But it was important for me to share it because I think that it's something that many people of color struggle with, but I don't think it's something that we actually seek help for, and I feel like it's something that that we don't talk about it. And if anything, I think there's a feeling of shame, that of course, you shouldn't admit to these things, you shouldn't feel this way, because I don't know, I guess that, that people think that you should be strong enough, to not, to avoid that, but I mean, I
think it's crucial to talk about this.
Yes.
And Claudia Rankine in Don't Let Me Be Lonely, as you probably know, talks a bit about mental health and anxiety and depression as well. And I think we just need more and more voices talking. And it might be an interesting moment, because as I hear you talk about your brother Joshua, it seems like it's one of the stories that just animates your writing, that animates you, that you're obsessed with, because you talk about all writers have 2 or 3 stories that they're obsessed with, and they keep kind of coming back to them and working. And you're talking about, I'm going to slaughter these names, so just correct me, Numa and Druin, the executees, as being one of the stories for you that you keep coming back to. I wonder what the others are. I kind of want to peek into that brain. Yeah. What are the stories that animate the
others
writing?
I probably couldn't share in public.
Really? That just makes me want to know more now. We're new BFFs.
I think they change, right? Because life is fluid. The one you're talking about is this execution of two young men who were living here and went to Haiti even before I was born. It was in 1964, and they wanted to fight the dictatorship. And the intriguing thing about their group was called Jeune Haïti, Young Haiti, and it was sort of like it's the fantasy that I think sort of people like my parents' generation also, they admired, sort of like that they were these young people who never forgot the homeland, so much so that they were willing to go back and fight. And I think, like, secretly they hope to raise children like that, except the dying part, right? they hope to people who would have fervor and go back and change the country. So that was one of those stories, because I think a lot of us grew up with these stories of sort of with these conflicting narratives about Haiti that my parents certainly had. I don't know if everybody's about, but it was like, oh, it was so beautiful, and then don't go. It was sort of both that, like their nostalgia and also the fear of the present moment. And so I think those stories changed. Like when I went with my father to Haiti for the first time, I had been going, he hadn't gone in 27 years. And finally I said, Papa, why are you afraid to go? He said, all my friends are dead. So he that was like a trip he didn't want to make, and finally we made the trip together. So moments like that, of course, when the birth of my daughter, the death of my parents, and I think it changes as you go, but certainly a very big one is that moment of leaving. That being 12 years old and getting on the plane and coming here, and being when my mother was leaving when I was 4 years old. I think that's my first memory of. I wasn't told my mother was leaving, so I thought I was going with her. And when we get to the airport, of having being a 4-year-old, being peeled off my mother's body, and she gets on the plane, and I see her like 6 years later, things like that. I mean. But I think that's why I'm interested in separations and things like how people reconstruct themselves after they've traveled, after the migration is something I'm very interested. That's feels very personal for me. But I think those things change as we live more, right? Because what our lives are today, they may not be tomorrow. You sort of the next big event, good or bad, can always potentially lie ahead. So it's pretty fluid, I think, those 2 or 3 things.
Right. And I guess I want to ask you, too, just because what you were saying there resonated with what we were talking about earlier, and I managed to move us away from it, that idea of not being able to go home again. Does it feel like that to you, not being able to go home again? Is it different when you go back?
Oh, no, I can go anytime. I remember there was just a period before I was 18 years old where my going had to do with my parents, and they were afraid to go. But after that, as soon as I could go, I would go. Sometimes I would go and I'd tell my parents I was going, because if you go in the family manner, you're kind of stuck in a relative's house the whole visit. and they might take you out once in a while, show you a little something, and then bring you back in. So I would go, sometimes I would go to Haiti with friends, and I would tell my parents until I got back, or sometimes I'd tell them when I got there. And, and they would always say, if something happens to you, you're not going to call your uncle while you're there to say, guess where I am, But that was the only way I could see the country for myself,
Right.
that I could travel freely around and also it was a good way to see it on my own terms, without sort of the eyes of my relatives. So it was like to see it like a stranger. But now it's like, when I go with my daughters who are very young, and my youngest, I remember, she had this idea that echoed very much back to how older Haitians used to say, like, wherever you were leaving to the United States, whatever state you were going, it was New York, New York. So my daughter had that same thing, like we'd be in Minnesota, she'd think she was in New York. So I remember one time we were on a very rocky road in Haiti, and she was like 3, she looks up and she goes, "This is not New York." That was like the break for her. But there was the wonderful thing for them. Like, I go and I see it through their eyes, and that was very important to me. Like for them to start to see it like any other place. That it wasn't, so they wouldn't have a sort of complicated burden relationship with it. Like, it was just a place we go, a place we love and enjoy.
I wanted to give you a chance to talk about Mississippi, but I have race on my mind now. And I want to think about like race in your work and racism in the work. And I want to I'm going to quote you again. This is a 2013 interview with Roxane Gay. And she's, you say, "I'm fairly pessimistic about the possibility of people in the current South having complicated conversations about race, because we're so conditioned to respond quickly and emotionally with all the vitriol that's been bred into us when race arises." So part of me wonders, 2 years later, do you still feel the same way?
Yes.
You do?
Yes. Yes.
Gotta get you to say more.
Yes, I moved back, right? So I live there now. And right now, I just don't think that we are, I think that we're too emotionally invested in, I don't know, I guess in these myths that we have about ourselves and our history and our past and our culture. And I also think that there has been, I think that for decades, that something that has happened in the South and maybe in the United States as a whole is that we, or the sort of larger, white culture has, has sort of told themselves like over and over again that we don't have a problem with race anymore because the civil rights movement happened, and you can vote and you can live wherever you want and you can go to any school, that you want. So therefore, it's no big deal. Why are you, what problem do you have, right? So why are you overreacting? Why are you, and I think that people, that we've talked ourselves into believing that is the case, especially in the South. And I think that that another thing that has happened in the South is that there's been a very like selective embrace of history, right, and of the past and of culture. I was just talking about this with my editor earlier because we were talking about the domestic slave trade and the fact that New Orleans was like the biggest, like that was the hub for the domestic slave trade in the United States. Once it was the like importation of slaves was done away with, right? So then like the hub of the slave trade was New Orleans, and the fact that there are 2 plaques in New Orleans that commemorate that, even though this was the hub, and one of those plaques is in the wrong location and it's incorrect. And there are no official tours that you can take in, like if you go to New Orleans, that will point out important landmarks in the city where, where this like, massive sort of like industry was taking place, right? Where people were bought and sold. And so, and to me, that is a perfect example of, of what I feel has happened in the country as a whole, and especially in the South, where there's just been this like denial of history, or so say the textbook scandal, right, in Texas, right, where the caption was, these workers were bought over, workers. The word slavery or slaves, like that wasn't even, those words weren't even used. And so, I think that there's been this push to deny and to forget, and I feel like something that I return to again and again is this desire to write against that and to push against that, and to acknowledge, how strongly, how important history is and how strongly it figures in the present. Now, I don't know if I answered your question. I hope I answered your question.
It's a huge question. In the back of Men We Read, that last chapter, you get to a lot of the structural problems around poverty, around race, around racism.
Yes.
No, yeah, you definitely touched on it. I would love to hear from you as well on this.
Well, I think probably, I think there was this huge conversation about race that was never had, right? And then suddenly we have a black president, and that's supposed to be like magically post-racial, and maybe that sort of further silenced that conversation, because like you can't be black and talk about race then suddenly without being shrill or like you're complaining. And I think it has to do. So what we're seeing on a lot of the campuses too, and as far as, even in South Africa, is a revision of those conversations, and conversations that perhaps should have been had earlier. And now, young people, I think because of Black Lives Matter and what we've been seeing with police violence all around the country, has revived that it's sort of the need to have these conversations and to have them in open public forums, and hopefully they will be had, because you have young people who are politicized, who are fed up, frankly, and it's very encouraging to see. And I think we're forced to have some version now of this conversation of what it means to be black or to be a person of color in this country, and what it means to be in a setting like this, and it's interesting to see how it's having this effect, that it's being picked up, like one incident inspiring another, and maybe finally this conversation will be had loudly, and it's not always smooth, but it's necessary and urgent.
I think that's key. I think we have to be willing to have some really uncomfortable conversations, and people often don't want to do that. They want to move very quickly, and sometimes we don't have the language to talk about it. And how do we deal with the urgency of it, and how do we give this kind of a sustained consideration? I think that's what I hear both of you like tapping on. And
well, but I have a lot of, I have a lot of faith in this generation, and their ability to have even gotten us to this level, where it's public, where it's out there, where it's in your face.
Yeah, I think that's important. Absolutely. Because I can't remember which one of you say this, but there's a moment where, I think it might be you, Jesmyn, where you're talking about silence concealing rage and violence and fear. And one of the themes that runs through both of your work is this idea of giving voice and this idea of silence. And how is it that we give voice to the silence that conceals this rage and violence and fear? And how do you do it in your nonfiction as well as your fiction?
I just think that it's important to speak. Because I feel like in speaking we assert our humanity, and so, I just feel like it's very important that we, if we are because we are dissatisfied, because we do feel devalued, because, we feel like in many ways that we are not, that we're being like denied, that our status as human beings is being denied. And so I think that, that there's power in speaking, that there's power in like raising our voices and uniting them together and asserting that we are human beings, and that we do have value, and that our lives do matter, and that we have worth, and that we are an important, we are important to this country,
right. The thing that should go without saying has to be said.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think what's also been powerful is the alliances. For example, people that I've seen are very active, like in my community in the immigration, who are very active in immigration, were really sort of now joined to the Dreamers and Black Lives Matter and all these alliances where people felt like this was my issue, this was my matter, and all these coalitions that are being formed, I think, that are very powerful in terms of realizing that we all have a stake in each other's liberation, and I think that's something that I also see, just in my own corner of the world, that these alliances that seem new, that are being formed, and people are investing themselves in other people's struggles more than I had seen in the past.
Yeah, I'm both sanguine about that, and I'm also a little bit nervous because I feel like those alliances are because they're new, one worries that the groups will become divisive. Well, no, our agenda matters more, this agenda matters more, and getting them, into that coalition alliance framework.
No, I have a lot of faith in this in this generation. It's been really amazing to watch where it's sort of the intersections, gender, sexual orientation, immigration, Dreamers, Black Lives Matter. I think we have a group in sort of in that whole same the quote unquote the sort of like the post-racial moment where we grew up with certain realities and certain illusions, and we all grew up together in a certain way, and we all affected. I'm from this era. There weren't that many cameras around back then, but I grew up in sort of the Amadou Diallo, Abner Louima era.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Where we marched the Brooklyn Bridge and did all, and all that. And so that was just, that was sort of the beginning of sometimes of Black immigrants who come and they're like, I'm exempt from all that.
Right.
And then Abner Louima happened, Amadou Diallo, and then we realized that we're sort of all in this together. I see sort of more of a deepening of that, and I think more and more it's like they're more intersectional actions, and yeah, I have great faith in this in this group of young people. I sound like an old woman.
Equally sanguine, Jesmyn?
Yes.
Good.
Yes. I think I spend a lot of time on Twitter, even though I've been silent lately. But I feel like, what I see happening on social media, I feel like I see the same thing happening, right, on social media, that this is how, a lot of these groups are connecting and also being like very active and using their voices to, to express their concerns and to, to protest and to create some sort of change. So yes, I'm equally hopeful. And I just want to say that Edwidge wrote this beautiful essay about some of that, what she was talking about. So that will be coming out in book form sometime soon.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have to open the floor up in a minute, but just do a very quick plug about the new essay collection, which, of course, riffing on Baldwin, I'm going to
Yes,
love.
riffing on Baldwin. So the tentative title for the essay collection is The Fire This Time. So it's riffing on Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. And so... it's a collection of essays by writers of color, and I'm basically sort of, when I solicited them, and asked them to contribute, I'm just sort of, asking them to respond to what is, happening now, and, sort of what they think about about, race right now in America, and, police brutality and Black lives and et cetera, et cetera. So that will be coming out sometime soon, hopefully.
Well, maybe we can give a big round of applause and then open up for questions.